I'm holding in my hands and have just put into my Twitter feed a risk assessment of how partisans could manipulate the Electoral Count Act of 1887. Just how easily the outcome of a presidential election, think 2024, could be manipulated. The author of this piece is my next guest. He's war-gamed the situation. His name is Matthew Seligman. Here are some of his credentials. He's a lawyer and legal scholar based in Washington, D.C. His current work on election law focuses on disputed presidential elections. He's a fellow at the Center for Private Law at Yale Law School and has taught at the Harvard Law School on disputed elections. Matthew, thank you so much for being here. What is the Electoral Count Act of 1887?
Thanks for having me. The Electoral Count Act of 1887 was a law that Congress passed towards the end of the 19th century, and it was a response to a crisis that the nation faced in 1876. So the 1876 presidential election was deeply disputed in a way that no one alive can possibly imagine. So it was just after the Civil War, and it was very, very close between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden, and it came down to just a few states. Now, that's something that we've experienced in our lifetimes. What we haven't experienced in our lifetimes is that there was a serious question for 3 states about what the valid state government was. This was during Reconstruction, and there were serious questions about who the real governor, who the state legislature was for 3 states, South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. And so as a result of that, Congress received multiple competing slates of electors from different people claiming to speak on behalf of those 3 states. And so they had to try to sort it out. It was a complete crisis. It went almost up to election day. There was a serious risk of reignition of the Civil War. And it was ultimately a political compromise that avoided that. And so the political compromise was that the Northern Republican Rutherford B. Hayes became president, and Democrats acquiesced to that in exchange for the end of Reconstruction. And that's how Jim Crow started. So it was born out of this disputed presidential election. And before that, there was no way of resolving these sorts of crises. So about a decade later, Congress finally decided to act, and they passed this law to try to deal with this type of question. If there's a dispute about which the valid electors are for a state, how is Congress supposed to figure out which ones to count? And that's the genesis of the Electoral Count Act.
Has it been smooth sailing since 1887?
Almost entirely, but it's getting creaky. So in almost every election, there's no real dispute about who the electors are. And we litigate questions about elections through court, there are recounts, and then the question is settled. And so the prime example of how this can go is actually the election of 2000. That was one of the most bitterly disputed presidential elections in history. There were court cases. It went to the Supreme Court in a deeply controversial Supreme Court opinion in Bush v. Gore. And then the next day, Vice President Gore conceded. And not only that, Vice President Gore on January 6th of 2001 sat in the chair that Mike Pence was sitting in January 6th of 2021. And Vice President Gore presided over the count of electoral votes in which George W. Bush beat Vice President Gore. And that's the way it's almost always been, that disputes about elections are litigated through court, and then that's the end of it. What's changed is now the dispute has come to Congress.
And you maintain that with relative ease, this process could be manipulated, say, in 2024. What is the swing state governor's gambit? I think you coined those words. What do they mean?
That's right. So I've been thinking about this for several years, about the different strategies that partisans could use to manipulate this old, antiquated, and just bad structurally law. And so I think the strategy that is most effective and therefore most dangerous is, as you said, the swing state governor's gambit. And here's how it works. So the Electoral Count Act, people think about Congress, and that's, of course, natural. On January 6th, 2021, there was enormous focus, justifiably, on Congress, raising objections and maybe reversing the results of the election. But the Electoral Count Act actually is more like a relay race. It starts out with one runner, the states, and then they pass off the electoral votes, the baton, to the second actor, the second runner, Congress. And there can be cheating in either of those 2 stages. we focus so much on the second stage and haven't focused enough on the first. So that's where the swing state governor's gambit comes in. So the way the Electoral Count Act works is that it places enormous legal importance on which slate of electors is certified by the governor of the state. And so as a result, here's what can happen. So imagine for a second that Congress is controlled, one house of Congress, say the House of Representatives, is controlled by a radical, irresponsible party. And let's say the presidential election comes down to one state, just, for example, Georgia. And then the governor of that state just doesn't like the outcome or believes in conspiracy theories and says, I'm going to ditch, say, the election results of the state, and I'm just going to certify the electoral votes for a Republican President Trump. He says, Trump really won. Everything else is a conspiracy theory. So he certifies that slate of electors. Then it goes to Congress. The way the Electoral Count Act is written is the governor's certified slate counts unless both chambers vote to reject it. And if a radical faction of the Republican Party controls the House, then they won't. And so that's how it happens. A conspiracy of a swing state governor, an extremist radical swing state governor, and the House of Representatives acting together can, under the letter of the law, steal the electoral votes of the state.
So let's talk about whether that's fantastical, because one of the component parts is control of the House of Representatives. By the way, as you were speaking, I was reaching for Mark Bowden and Matthew Teague's book, which I just read, called The Steal, because they actually had an appendix of all the House members who objected to certifying the Electoral College votes in the 2020 election, making, I think, your point that it's not so outlandish to think that you could get a majority party in control of the House of Representatives. Obviously, Democrats control the House today, but what if all these individuals were in control of the House, which seems likely given where we're headed in the midterm, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. And this is a critical point about why I think governor manipulation is the more realistic and therefore dangerous threat, rather than Congress as a whole rejecting electoral votes, which is what we focused on in 2021. The reason is because 93 senators voted to reject those objections. But as you said, 150 plus members of the House voted to sustain them. I'm not so worried about the Senate going over the cliff in the near term. But the House of Representatives, if it's controlled by the radical faction that wants to be anti-democratic and reject electoral votes, well, I think that's a realistic threat. And there are politicians running for governorships in swing states right now on the platform that they would not have certified the valid electorate in 2020. So it's I respect the way that you're presenting this, because you don't want this to become an R versus D issue. You're presenting it as an academic and saying, look, here's a real threat that we face if there's one party that. But we are talking about what happens if Republicans retake the House of Representatives as they are expected to do, and if they go the way of the 150 in 2020, all it takes is one corruptible governor, arguably from a swing state, and you've got a different outcome in the election. As you're speaking, I'm wondering something. Do you think what Matthew Seligman has figured out was known to Eastman and Ellis, the lawyers who were writing memos in the Trump White House in the waning days of the Trump administration and advising him on how this could be? Did they know in sending Pence up there and putting pressure on him what you know? I don't think so, because I think they would have tried it if they had known.
Right.
Now it's important to point out it wouldn't have worked in 2020, and the reason
because they didn't control the House.
They didn't control the House. And so the difference here is where the political pieces are on the chessboard. But now we know that there's a faction of the Republican Party that is willing to use these maximalist manipulative strategies. And if the chips fall in the right way, democracy falls.
So something that I think factors into this mix, and I'm going to talk about this when my conversation with you ends, but I just saw data today, a headline: nearly 6 in 10 Republicans say they will not vote for any candidate who admits Biden won fair and square. And there's some portion of this that I need to parse and explain, but here's what it tells me. It tells me that those who are going to be running for Congress as Republicans, if they want to win over their base and get nominated, they are definitely going to go in the direction of saying Biden didn't win fair and square. Therefore, we know that they've got this preconceived idea of what happened in the last cycle, making them, I would say, more likely to be a part of what you're worried about for 2024.
I think that's exactly right. And that's why we're at a critical moment. So after the failure of the voting rights bills in Congress, there's been a rapid pivot to reforming the Electoral Count Act. And that's critically important for precisely the reasons that we've been talking about today. This is the year, this is the moment that this law can be fixed. If it isn't, then will the next Congress be able to do it? Will there be 60 senators? Will a Republican-controlled House be willing to pass a fix of this law? So I think there's immense urgency to get this done and get it done right and get it done now.
Let's just flesh this out in one more respect. So if Republicans, I want to go from the abstract to the tangible, and you did that in your paper. We're talking about Kevin McCarthy being the speaker and potentially David Perdue, and you should explain who he is and what his viewpoints are on this issue. But David Perdue is running for governor of Georgia. What if he wins? So what if it's Perdue? And what if a Republican House is now led by Kevin McCarthy? What is the worst case scenario?
The worst case scenario is that the election is very close in the Electoral College and it comes down to Georgia. Now, David Perdue is a former U.S. Senator, and he's now running for governor of Georgia. He's primarying the current Republican governor, Brian Kemp, and he's running precisely on the platform that he would not have certified the 2020 presidential election results for Georgia. So there's every reason to believe that there are no circumstances under which he would certify a Democratic win in Georgia in 2024. So here's the worst case scenario. President Biden or whoever the Democratic candidate is in 2024 wins the election and Georgia is the critical state. And then David Perdue has won and he says, I don't believe in those results. There was voter fraud. There were dead people voting, all sorts of conspiracy theories. So he signs a piece of paper, a certificate saying that President Trump's electors are the real electors for the state of Georgia. Now, Congress receives that. It has these fake, illegitimate electors, but it's signed by the governor. What is Congress supposed to do? Now, the way the law is written is that Congress is supposed to accept that piece of paper from the governor unless both houses vote to reject it. And the Kevin McCarthy radical Republican House of Representatives, well, they don't. And so as a result, David Perdue, who is a committed conspiracy theorist on this, as the governor of Georgia, plus a radical Republican House of Representatives, can steal a presidential election under the law right now.
Holy crap. I mean, what a scary scenario. Final question. What do we do about it? And what's the likelihood that something will be done about it before 2024?
So I'm a mix of an extreme pessimist. You can hear my worries about how this might go, but I'm also an optimist about how Congress might actually fix this. So there's a bipartisan group of 14 senators, Republicans and Democrats, working on this issue right now. Senators King and Klobuchar and Durbin have been working on this issue for almost a year in the background. And so there are these multiple reform efforts coming together right now. And this is different than other election law reform. There isn't really a partisan slant. We've talked about Republicans stealing an election here, but that's in the short term. 10 years ago, I couldn't have imagined that either party would have ever attempted something that happened like what happened in 2020. So this is a reform of a law that has to last 100 years or more. And I think the senators are beginning to understand the fragility of the legal framework of presidential democracy.
What about the House? But what about the House?
So the House is in, I think, responsible Democratic hands right now. And if that changes in 2023, then there's a serious problem. And that's why there's urgency, because I believe that Congress right now, a bipartisan coalition in the Senate and a bipartisan coalition, including responsible Republicans like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, I think you can get across the finish line this year. I'm not sure it can ever again.
I mean, maybe it wouldn't be. Here's my optimism. Maybe it wouldn't be a partisan vote even in the House if it were held sooner than later, because I don't think that all of the 150, I am very doubtful that the 150 in the House who voted not to accept the Electoral College outcome in 2020, I don't think they believe it. I think that they felt obligated. Trump had whipped them into a frenzy. Their constituents were focused on this. If there were to be a vote now about the Electoral Count Act of 1887, I don't think people are going to understand what it is. And I guess I'll put it in these terms. I think they could get away with it. I think Republicans.
I think you're absolutely right. I think, so unfortunately, I think the way things are headed, members of Congress are going to have to take a hard vote on one of two dates. One is January 6th of 2025, and the other is on a reform bill on the Electoral Count Act. And the second vote, the one on, as you say, the obscure law that people don't understand, that can actually fix the problem outside the heat of a crisis, I think that's politically an easier vote, and I think it's the right thing to do. So that's why I'm an optimist about this, that this is something that can be fixed where it takes politicians out of having to make a decision in a crisis.
Matthew, that was so well presented, and I really, really appreciate it. I had not focused on this possibility until you wrote on it. Now I see why that law school in Boston, I think it was, wanted you to come in and teach on the subject. So thank you very, very much. I appreciate your time.
Thanks very much for having me.
Matthew Seligman's a lawyer. He's a legal scholar. His current work on election law focuses on disputed presidential elections. He's a fellow at the Center for Private Law at the Yale Law School and previously taught at Harvard on exactly this subject.